The distant rumble of wagon wheels stirred dust on the horizon as Nora Wilson clutched her worn leather satchel, her knuckles white with apprehension. Wallace, Idaho loomed before her, a collection of wooden buildings that promised either salvation or another chapter of heartbreak in this unforgiving summer of 1875. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, but the wounds beneath her skin remained raw as the day she'd fled sent. Louis, 3 weeks prior, the coach jerked to a halt and Nora drew a steadying breath. 24 years old with nowhere left to run, she had chosen this mining boomtown not for its opportunities but for its obscurity. Wallace was far enough from her past, or so she prayed. "End of the line, madam," the driver announced, extending a weathered hand to help her down. Nora's boots hit the hard, packed dirt of Main Street, her green eyes surveying the scene before her. Men in dusty attire moved with purpose between the assayer's office and the saloon, while a few women in practical calico dresses carried baskets from the general store. The air smelled of pine from the surrounding mountains, smoke from the smelters, and the indefinable scent of a town built on silver dreams. "You got someone meeting you?" the driver asked, unloading her single trunk. "No, sir," she replied, adjusting her simple bonnet. "I'll manage." He tipped his hat before climbing back to his perch. Nora stood alone, the mountain sun beating down on her shoulders. She would need lodging, then work the money sewn into the hem of her skirt wouldn't last more than a fortnight. The Wallace Hotel stood at the corner, its newly painted sign a beacon of civilization. Gathering her courage along with her belongings, Nora walked toward it, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. A woman traveling alone invited speculation, and speculation was the last thing she needed. The hotel lobby offered blessed shade, its wooden floors recently swept. Behind the counter, a man with spectacles perched on a narrow nose glanced up from his ledger. "Room for one, please," Nora requested, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just yourself?" The clerk's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I've come to Wallace for work." The man nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. $2 a week, paid in advance, includes breakfast. Nora counted out the money, painfully aware of how quickly her savings would disappear. "I'll need recommendations for employment as well, if you'd be so kind." "Might try Miller's Mercantile," he suggested, handing her a brass key. "They're looking for help, especially someone who can figure numbers." His eyes assessed her worn but quality clothing. "You look like you've had some education." "I have, thank you," she replied, taking the key. "Room 7, second floor." The room was small but clean, a narrow bed with an iron frame, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a pine dresser with 3 drawers. Nora unpacked methodically, hanging her 3 dresses in the wardrobe and placing her father's silver-framed photograph on the dresser. Professor James Wilson smiled back at her from behind glass, unaware of what his daughter would endure after his passing 2 years ago. Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed her. Nora sat heavily on the bed, allowing herself one moment of weakness as tears slid silently down her cheeks. Tomorrow she would be strong again. Tomorrow she would build a life from the ashes of the old one. She didn't hear the shouts at first, her mind too consumed with memories. But when a gunshot cracked through the afternoon stillness, Nora jumped to her feet, heart pounding. She moved to the window, peering cautiously onto the street below. A group of men had gathered outside the saloon across the way, their voices raised in anger. At their center stood 2 figures, one tall and broad-shouldered in a dust-covered duster coat, the other swaying slightly, a revolver dangling from his hand. "You're drunk, Hawkins," the taller man stated, his voice carrying even to Nora's window. "Go home before you do something you'll regret." Don't tell me what to do, Garrett, the drunken man slurred, waving his gun dangerously. You ain't the law in this town. No, but I'm the closest thing to it until Marshal Porter returns, came the level reply. Now hand over the gun. Nora held her breath as the standoff continued. The man called Garrett stood with casual confidence, one hand resting near his holstered pistol, the other extended palm up. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but Nora could see a strong jaw lined with stubble. The drunk swayed, cursed, and finally spat in the dust. Fine. Take the damned thing. He tossed the gun, which Garrett caught deftly with one hand. The crowd dispersed, disappointment evident in their postures. No blood would be spilled for their entertainment today. Nora released the breath she'd been holding and stepped back from the window, her heart still racing. This was Wallace, a place where men settled disputes with guns in broad daylight. Had she merely exchanged one dangerous situation for another? Morning arrived with the clanging of a distant bell and the smell of coffee drifting up from below. Nora dressed carefully in her best blue dress, severe enough for propriety, but well-tailored enough to suggest competence. Her chestnut hair was swept into a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and she wore her mother's small pearl earrings for courage. At the hotel dining room, she ate quickly, avoiding conversation with the other guests, mostly traveling salesmen and mining engineers. Then, gathering her references and the small ledger that proved her bookkeeping abilities, she set out for Miller's Mercantile. The store occupied a prime corner of Main Street, its windows displaying everything from mining equipment to bolts of fabric. A bell tinkled as Nora entered, and she was immediately enveloped in the comforting smell of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods. "Be with you in a moment," called a cheerful voice from behind a mountain of crates. Nora waited, taking in the organized chaos. The shelves reached to the ceiling, packed with merchandise of every description: tools, foodstuffs, medicines, clothing. This wasn't so different from her father's bookshop in St. Louis, she thought with a pang of nostalgia. "Now then, what can I help you with?" An older man with friendly eyes and flour-dusted sleeves emerged, wiping his hands on an apron. "Mr. Miller?" Nora inquired. "That's me. Abraham Miller at your service. My name is Nora Wilson. I was told you might be looking for help with bookkeeping." Mr. Miller's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I am indeed, though most folks don't know that yet." He studied her with newfound interest. "You have experience." "I kept the accounts for my father's bookshop for 5 years, sir," she replied, offering her carefully preserved references. "And I'm quick with figures." He reviewed the papers thoughtfully. "St. Louis, eh? What brings you all the way to Wallace?" Nora had prepared for this question. "A fresh start, Mr. Miller. My father passed, and there was nothing left for me there." It wasn't entirely a lie, though it omitted the nightmare that had followed her father's death: her hasty marriage to Thomas Blackwell, a man whose charming facade had hidden a monster. A man whose connections in St. Louis had made escape nearly impossible until now. "Well, Miss Wilson, Mrs." she corrected automatically, then wished she hadn't. The less connection to her past, the better. "Mrs. Wilson," he amended. "I can offer you a position at $12 a week. Hours are long during mining paydays, light or otherwise. You'll have Sundays off, of course." Relief washed over her. "That would be more than adequate, Mr. Miller. When would you like me to start?" "No time like the present," he smiled, gesturing to a small desk tucked into the corner near the back of the store. "My ledgers are in a frightful state, I'm afraid. My daughter used to keep them, but she married a fellow from Boise last spring." Nora spent the morning immersed in columns of figures, grateful for the familiar work that required concentration enough to quiet her anxious mind. Mr. Miller was a fair businessman who extended credit to minors, but kept careful track of what was owed. By noon, she had already organized a month's worth of receipts and begun transferring them to the main ledger. "You're a godsend," Mr. Miller declared, bringing her a cup of tea. "Take a break. You've earned it." The bell above the door chimed as Nora sipped her tea. She looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the bright rectangle of the doorway. As he stepped inside, she recognized the man from yesterday's confrontation garret. In the clear light of the store, she could see him properly. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps early 30s, with eyes the color of a summer storm and hair the rich brown of coffee. A badge glinted on his chest, partly obscured by the open front of his duster. "Morning, Abe," he greeted Miller with easy familiarity. "Got that order in for me?" "Indeed I do, Deputy," Miller replied, bustling toward the storeroom. "And I've finally found someone to rescue my books. Mrs. Wilson, this is Deputy Ben Garrett. Ben, this is Mrs. Nora Wilson, newly arrived from back east." Ben Garrett turned toward her, and Nora felt a jolt of recognition pass between them. He'd seen her at the window yesterday, she realized with embarrassment. "Madam," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. His eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary, and Nora resisted the urge to touch the fading bruise on her cheek. "Deputy," she replied, nodding politely before returning her attention to the ledger. She could feel his gaze on her still, assessing, curious. "You picking up for the marshal too?" Miller asked, returning with a crate of supplies. "Porter won't be back for another week at least," Ben replied, his deep voice resonating in the quiet store. "Council's got me handling things till then. How's the situation up at the Lucky Strike?" Miller inquired, wrapping parcels in brown paper. "Tense," Ben admitted. "Owners brought in some new men from Chicago. The miners don't like it much." Their conversation continued, but Nora focused on her work, letting their words wash over her. Mining disputes and town politics were not her concern. Remaining invisible was. At day's end, Nora gathered her shawl, pleased with her progress, and the knowledge that she now had steady employment. Mr. Miller had even advanced her a portion of her first week wages, allowing her to purchase a few necessities from the store before leaving. The street was busy with miners coming off shift, their faces blackened with silver dust, their voices loud after hours of underground labor. Nora kept to the boardwalk, eyes downcast, moving quickly toward the hotel. She was nearly there when a voice called out from across the street. "Mrs. Wilson." She turned to see Deputy Garrett striding toward her, leading his horse by the reins. Against her better judgment, Nora waited, clutching her parcels tighter. "Allow me to escort you," he offered, falling into step beside her. "Streets get rowdy this time of day." "Thank you, Deputy, but I'm perfectly capable of walking 100 yards to my hotel," she replied, more curtly than she'd intended. His lips twitched with the hint of a smile. "No doubt, but my mother raised me to see ladies safely to their destinations, especially new arrivals." They walked in silence for a few paces before he spoke again. "Wallace can be overwhelming at first," he said conversationally. "Silver brought all kinds here, good folk and otherwise." "I've found everyone quite civil so far," Nora replied cautiously, "including Hawkins yesterday." There was that almost smile again. "I saw you watching from the hotel," heat rushed to Nora's cheeks. "I wasn't prying, merely startled by the commotion." They reached the hotel entrance and Nora turned to bid him good evening, eager to escape his perceptive gaze. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Wallace is growing fast, but it's still a small town in many ways. If you find yourself in need of assistance, any kind of assistance, my office is next to the assayers." The offer seemed sincere, but Nora had learned the hard way about trusting a man's apparent kindness. "I'll keep that in mind, Deputy. Good evening." That night, Nora wrote in her journal by lamplight, recording her first full day in Wallace. The work at Miller's suited her perfectly detailed, methodical, and largely solitary. If she could maintain her position and keep to herself, perhaps she could build something resembling peace here. Her thoughts drifted to Deputy Garrett. There was something unsettling about the way he'd looked at her, not with the predatory interest she'd come to fear from men, but with a kind of knowing that made her feel exposed, as if he could read the fear that she carried like a second skin. Nora extinguished her lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the saloon piano and men's laughter. Sleep would come eventually, but first she would endure the nightly parade of memories: her father's death, Thomas's initial kindness giving way to cruelty, and finally her desperate flight west after that last terrible night when his rage had nearly killed her. "No one will believe you," Thomas had told her as she lay bleeding on their bedroom floor. "I own half the judges in this city." He'd been right about that much. But here, 3,000 miles from St. Louis, perhaps she could finally disappear. The days fell into a pattern as June stretched toward July. Nora arose early, breakfasted quickly, and spent her days immersed in the mercantile's accounts. Mr. Miller proved a kind employer who valued her work and respected her privacy. The townspeople came to recognize her as Miller's bookkeeper, nodding politely when she passed, but not pressing for personal details. On Sundays, Nora attended services at the small white church on Pine Street, sitting in the back pew and slipping out before the congregation could engage her in conversation. Afternoons, she spent walking in the hills above town when weather permitted, finding solace in the vastness of the Idaho wilderness. Occasionally, she encountered Deputy Garrett about town, maintaining order when the miners were paid, settling disputes between freight wagons on the narrow streets, or simply drinking coffee at the hotel restaurant. He always acknowledged her with a respectful nod, but never imposed his presence upon her, for which she was grateful. Life developed a rhythm that, if not happy, was at least predictable. Until the third Friday in July, when the stagecoach arrived carrying a ghost from her past. Nora was returning from delivering the weekly orders to the smelter office when she saw the coach pull up before the hotel. Passengers disembarked one by one: a woman with 2 children, an older gentleman with a carpet bag, and finally, a tall figure in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in Wallace. Her heart stopped. Even from half a block away, she would know that posture anywhere: the straight back, the confident set of the shoulders. Robert Blackwell, Thomas's older brother and business partner, had found her. Nora ducked into the narrow alley between the hardware store and the barber shop, pressing herself against the rough wood siding as panic clawed at her throat. Robert was as dangerous as Thomas, perhaps more so for his calculating nature. If he had tracked her to Wallace, it could only mean one thing: Thomas wanted her back. The irony was bitter. She had chosen Wallace precisely because the new rail spur hadn't reached it yet, thinking the difficulty of access would deter pursuit. Instead, Robert had simply followed her paper trail: the stagecoach tickets, perhaps, or inquiries at hotels along the way. When she was certain Robert had entered the hotel, Nora slipped back to the mercantile through side streets, her mind racing. She would need to leave immediately, abandon her position, the small security she had built, and flee further west. Perhaps Oregon or California. Mr. Miller looked up in surprise as she burst through the back door. "Mrs. Wilson, you're white as a sheet." "I'm sorry," she gasped, gathering her personal items from the desk. "I must leave. There's been an emergency." "What's happened? Are you ill?" His kind face creased with concern. No, she couldn't explain, couldn't risk involving him. "I'm terribly sorry, but I must go." "At least let me pay you what I owe," he insisted, moving to the cash drawer. "There's no time," Nora said, her voice cracking as she stuffed her ledger and pencils into her satchel. "Please, Mr. Miller, I've been a good employee, haven't I?" "The best I've had," he confirmed, bewildered by her behavior. "Then trust me when I say I must leave Wallace today. Now." She grasped his weathered hands impulsively. "And if anyone asks after me, anyone at all, please say you know nothing of my whereabouts." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're in some kind of trouble, child." It wasn't a question, but Nora nodded regardless, tears threatening to spill. "Then you should speak with Ben Garrett," Mr. Miller said firmly. "He's a good man, and he knows how to handle difficult situations." "No," Nora shook her head vehemently. "No authorities, please." "Ben's different," Miller insisted. But Nora was already heading for the door. "Thank you for everything," she called over her shoulder. She hurried back to the hotel, taking a circuitous route and checking constantly for signs of Robert. The lobby was empty when she slipped inside and up the stairs to her room. There, she threw her few possessions into her trunk with shaking hands. The stage coach to Boys wouldn't leave until morning, which meant she needed somewhere to hide for the night. The stable, perhaps, or one of the abandoned mining shacks on the edge of town. A knock at her door froze her in place. "Mrs. Wilson," a female voice called. "Are you in there, Mrs. Peterson?" The hotel owner's wife, not Robert. Nora exhaled shakily. "Yes," she replied, opening the door a crack. "There's a gentleman downstairs asking after you," Mrs. Peterson said. "A Mr. Blackwell, says he's family." Ice filled Nora's veins. "Please tell him you haven't seen me," she whispered urgently. "I beg you." Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened, but she nodded slowly. "Is there something I should know?" "The less you know, the better," Nora said grimly. "But that man means me harm." The older woman's lips thinned with determination. "Wait here. I'll send him on a wild goose chase and come back." True to her word, Mrs. Peterson returned 10 minutes later. "I told him you'd checked out yesterday, heading for Coeur d'Alene," she reported. "He seemed mighty put out about it." "Thank you," Nora breathed. "But he'll check the stage office next. I need to leave Wallace tonight." "Nonsense," Mrs. Peterson declared. "You need protection, not flight." She smoothed her apron decisively. "I'm sending for Deputy Garrett." "No," Nora protested, but Mrs. Peterson was already heading for the stairs with surprising speed for a woman of her bulk. Left alone, Nora resumed packing, determined to be gone before the deputy arrived. Robert was a persuasive man who moved in influential circles. There was no guarantee that any local lawman would take her side against his smooth explanations and legal documents. She had just fastened her trunk when another knock came at the door. "Mrs. Wilson." The deep voice was unmistakable. "It's Deputy Garrett. May I come in?" Nora hesitated, then opened the door reluctantly. Ben Garrett filled the doorframe, his expression grave. Behind him stood Mrs. Peterson, looking both worried and satisfied with her intervention. "Mrs. Peterson says you're in some kind of trouble," Ben said without preamble. "A misunderstanding," Nora replied stiffly. "I'm handling it by leaving town." Ben glanced at her packed trunk. "Running rarely solves problems, madam, especially when they follow you." "This one has," she admitted, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "He's at the Cedar Street Saloon now, according to Mrs. Peterson." "The man asking for you, who is he?" Ben asked, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him. Mrs. Peterson remained outside, standing guard. Nora hesitated. How much could she safely reveal? "His name is Robert Blackwell. He's my brother-in-law. And you're afraid of him," Ben observed, his gray eyes missing nothing. "Why, it's complicated," Nora evaded, wringing her hands. "But I assure you, Deputy, my fears are well-founded." "Mrs. Wilson, Nora," Ben said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "I can't help you if you don't tell me what we're dealing with." The use of her given name startled her. She looked up to find him watching her with genuine concern, and something in his steady gaze made her want to trust him despite every instinct warning against it. "My husband," she began haltingly. "Thomas Blackwell is a wealthy businessman in St. Louis. Our marriage was not what I expected." Ben nodded, encouraging her to continue. "He has a temper," Nora said, the understatement bitter on her tongue. "After my father died, there was no one to intervene when he—" She touched her cheek unconsciously, where the bruise had long since faded, understanding hardened Ben's features. "He hurt you." "Regularly," Nora confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The last time I thought he would kill me. I managed to escape while he was away on business and fled west. And now his brother has tracked you down to bring you back," Ben concluded. Nora nodded miserably. "Thomas has political connections, money, influence. In St. Louis, the law is on his side. A husband has rights over his wife, and my word means nothing against his." "This isn't St. Louis," Ben said firmly, "and I don't give a damn about Thomas Blackwell's connections." The vehemence in his voice surprised her. "I appreciate your sentiment, Deputy, but Robert won't be dissuaded easily. He'll create a scene, make accusations. The simplest solution is for me to disappear again." "Running won't end this," Ben insisted. "They found you once, they'll find you again." "Let me handle Blackwell." "How?" Nora asked, desperation edging her voice. "You can't arrest him for looking for his brother's wife." "No," Ben agreed, "but I can make it clear that you're under the protection of Wallace law and that his presence is unwelcome here." His jaw set in a determined line. "Stay here. Keep your door locked. I'll return once I've dealt with him." Before she could protest further, Ben was gone, his boot heels echoing down the hallway. Nora paced the small confines of her room, anxiety mounting with each passing minute. This was madness. She should be on the road already, putting distance between herself and Robert. Instead, she had placed her fate in the hands of a man she barely knew in a town where she had no real allies. An hour passed, then another. Outside, the sky darkened to purple, then black. Nora lit her lamp and continued her restless pacing, jumping at every creak and distant shout. Finally, approaching footsteps made her freeze. A firm knock followed. "Mrs. Wilson." "It's Ben Garrett." She unlocked the door with trembling fingers. Ben stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable in the shadowed corridor. "May I come in?" he asked. Nora stepped aside, noting a darkening mark on his jawline and what appeared to be a tear in his shirt cuff. "What happened?" she asked, suddenly afraid of the answer. "Robert Blackwell is on the eastbound stage," Ben stated simply, removing his hat as he entered. "It left 20 minutes ago." Disbelief warred with hope in Nora's chest. "How did you convince him to go?" The ghost of a smile touched Ben's lips. "Let's just say I presented a compelling argument for his immediate departure." He touched his jaw ruefully, though not before he tried to make his case with his fists. "You fought him?" Nora was aghast. "Only after he took the first swing," Ben assured her. "When I explained that you had filed charges of harassment against him." "But I didn't," Nora interrupted. "Well, we can remedy that tomorrow," Ben said smoothly. Anyway, when faced with spending a few weeks in the Wallace jail awaiting circuit court versus leaving on the next stage, Mr. Blackwell made the sensible choice. Relief threatened to buckle Nora's knees. She sank onto the edge of her bed, trembling with reaction. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Ben replied, remaining standing. "It's my job to keep the peace in Wallace. That includes ensuring that citizens aren't harassed by unwelcome visitors." "He'll be back," Nora said, reality reasserting itself through her momentary relief. "Or Thomas will come himself next time." "Possibly," Ben acknowledged, "but now we'll be prepared. And I've sent telegrams to the marshals in surrounding towns with descriptions of both men. They won't catch us by surprise again." Nora looked up at him, overwhelmed by his matter-of-fact competence. "Why are you helping me like this? You don't even know me." Something flickered in Ben's eyes, a shadow of old pain quickly masked. "I know enough," he said quietly. "I know you're hardworking and honest. I know you've been running scared since you arrived in Wallace. And I know that no woman deserves to live in fear of her husband." He seemed about to say more, then checked himself. "It's late. You should rest. I'll have breakfast sent up in the morning, and then we can discuss more permanent arrangements for your security." As he turned to leave, Nora found her voice again. "Deputy Garrett, Ben, what exactly did you tell Robert?" Ben paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "I told him you were under my protection now, and that if he or his brother ever set foot in Wallace again, they'd regret it thoroughly." The quiet certainty in his voice left no doubt that he meant every word. After he'd gone, Nora unpacked her trunk with hands that still trembled. For the first time since arriving in Wallace, she fell asleep without reliving Thomas's violence in her dreams. Morning brought sunshine streaming through her window, and the promised breakfast tray delivered by Mrs. Peterson herself, who fussed over Nora like a mother hen. "Deputy Garrett told us everything," she declared, pouring coffee. "That man had some nerve, coming here thinking he could drag you back to that monster." Nora nearly choked on her toast. "Everything?" "About your husband's abuse and your escape," Mrs. Peterson clarified. "Don't worry, we're all on your side. Half the town's talking about how Ben sent that fancy Eastern fellow packing on last night's stage." Dismay flooded Nora. Her private shame was now public knowledge. "I didn't want everyone to know," she said faintly. Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. "People need to know who they're standing with, dear, and Wallace stands with you." After breakfast, Nora dressed carefully for work, uncertain whether Mr. Miller would still want her services after yesterday's abrupt departure. She needn't have worried. "There she is," he exclaimed when she entered the mercantile. "Our heroine returned." "I'm so sorry about yesterday," Nora began, but Mr. Miller waved away her apology. "Ben explained everything. That brother-in-law of yours has some nerve, I'll tell you that." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Though I hear Ben's right hook gave him something to remember Wallace by." Mortified but touched by his support, Nora settled at her desk and tried to focus on the ledgers. Throughout the morning, customers came and went, many nodding to her with newfound respect or murmuring words of encouragement. The town blacksmith's wife even brought her a jar of preserved peaches to sweeten your day, Mrs. Wilson. By noon, Nora was overwhelmed by the unexpected support. When the bell above the door signaled another arrival, she didn't immediately look up from her calculations. "Mrs. Wilson." Ben stood before her desk, looking more official than usual in a clean shirt and polished badge. "Deputy Garrett," she acknowledged, setting down her pencil. "Is there news?" "Nothing urgent," he assured her. "But I was hoping you might join me for lunch at the hotel restaurant. There are some matters we should discuss." Curious eyes watched them leave the mercantile together, and Nora felt heat rising in her cheeks at the speculation she sensed brewing. In a town this size, being seen dining with the handsome deputy would certainly start tongues wagging. The hotel restaurant was relatively quiet, the lunch rush not yet begun. Ben selected a table near the window, pulling out Nora's chair with unexpected gallantry before taking his seat opposite her. "I hope I haven't embarrassed you," he said after they'd ordered. demonstrating that perceptive quality that both unsettled and intrigued her. "Small towns run on gossip, I'm afraid." "I'm beginning to understand that," Nora replied wryly, "though I confess I didn't expect quite so much support." "Wallace looks after its own," Ben stated simply. "And you've become one of us, whether you intended to or not." The waitress brought their meal beef stew for Ben, chicken and dumplings for Nora, providing a momentary pause in their conversation. "You mentioned wanting to discuss some matters," Nora prompted after they'd begun eating. Ben nodded, his expression growing more serious. "I've been considering your situation. Robert Blackwell's appearance confirms that your husband hasn't given up on finding you." "No," Nora agreed softly. "Thomas doesn't surrender what he considers his property." A muscle tightened in Ben's jaw at her words. "I've consulted with Judge Harding, who comes through on circuit next month. There may be legal options available to you: annulment or even divorce, given the circumstances." Nora nearly dropped her fork. "Divorce?" The word itself was scandalous. "Is that even possible?" "Idaho territory has more progressive laws regarding marriage dissolution than some states," Ben explained. "Cruelty is recognized as legitimate grounds." He hesitated, then continued more gently, "But you would need to testify to the abuse." The prospect of publicly detailing Thomas's violence made Nora's stomach churn. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted. "You don't have to decide today," Ben assured her. "But it's an option to consider, especially if you intend to remain in Wallace long term." "And if Thomas comes before then?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. Ben's eyes hardened to granite. "Then he'll find that Wallace protects its own. I've deputized several reliable men to keep watch for strangers, and I've arranged for you to move to more secure lodgings." "Move?" "But I've only just settled at the hotel." "The hotel is too public, too accessible," Ben explained. "Mrs. Sanderson has a cottage behind the school that she rents to teachers. It's vacant until the new schoolmistress arrives in September, and she's agreed to let it to you at a reduced rate." Nora was speechless at this arrangement made without her consultation. Reading her expression, Ben added hastily, "Of course, it's entirely your choice." "I only thought—" "No," Nora interrupted, embarrassed by her reaction. "It's a kind offer I'm just not accustomed to." "Help." Something softened in Ben's gaze. "I understand. Independence is hard-won and not easily surrendered, even to well-meaning assistants." His insight startled her. "Yes, exactly." They finished their meal discussing practicalities when she could view the cottage. What additional security measures might be prudent? How to proceed if Thomas or Robert reappeared? Throughout it all, Nora found herself relaxing in Ben's presence in a way she hadn't with any man since her father's death. As they parted outside the restaurant, Ben surprising her with the gentle courtesy of kissing her hand, Nora realized that, for the first time in years, she felt something like hope taking root in the barren soil of her heart. The cottage behind the schoolhouse proved to be a charming solution to Nora's housing dilemma. Small but well-built, with a vegetable garden already established and a view of the mountains from the back porch, it offered both security and solitude. Ben personally installed new locks on the doors and shutters for the windows, while Mr. Miller provided a brass bell to ring if trouble comes calling. July melted into August, bringing hot days and pleasantly cool evenings to the mountain town. Nora settled into a routine in her new home, discovering an unexpected talent for gardening and even acquiring a striped cat who appeared on her porch one evening and decided to stay. "Tiger's a good mouser," Ben commented one Sunday afternoon as the cat wound around his ankles. He had taken to escorting Nora home from church each week, often staying for coffee on her porch. These Sunday visits became the highlight of Nora's week, though she was careful not to examine too closely the warmth that spread through her whenever Ben arrived, hat in hand, at her gate. They spoke of books they had read, childhood memories, and the daily happenings in Wallace, carefully avoiding mention of Thomas or the approaching circuit court date. As August waned, the first golden leaves appeared on the aspen trees that dotted the hillsides, and Wallace prepared for its annual harvest festival. The entire town would gather for music, dancing, games, and a community meal to celebrate the season's bounty before winter descended on the mountains. "You'll come, won't you?" Mrs. Miller asked Nora as they sorted through new bolts of fabric that had arrived at the mercantile. "Everyone will be there." "I'm not much for large gatherings," Nora demurred, though in truth, she had been considering attending. 3 months in Wallace had begun to heal some of the wounds Thomas had inflicted on her spirit, and the prospect of celebration no longer filled her with dread. "Deputy Garrett will be disappointed if you don't," Mrs. Miller said with a knowing smile that made Nora blush to the roots of her hair. "I'm sure the deputy has more important concerns than my attendance at a town festival," she replied primly, though her heart quickened at the thought of Ben looking for her among the crowd. The day of the festival dawned clear and warm, with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Nora took special care with her appearance, selecting her green dress that brought out the color of her eyes and arranging her hair in loose curls, rather than her usual severe knot. She even added a touch of rose water behind her ears, a small extravagance purchased from Mr. Miller's latest shipment. The town square had been transformed with lanterns, bunting, and tables laden with food contributed by every household. A platform had been erected for the musicians, and children darted between groups of chatting adults, their excitement palpable in the afternoon sunshine. Nora arrived as the festivities were beginning, slipping quietly into the crowd. Several people greeted her warmly, offering plates of food or introducing family members who had arrived from neighboring communities for the celebration. Mrs. Wilson, a small whirlwind in the form of 8-year-old Sally Jenkins, collided with Nora's skirts. "You came. Do you want to see my ribbon? I want it for my apple pie." Nora allowed the child to drag her toward the display of baked goods, smiling at Sally's enthusiasm. The little girl had appointed herself Nora's special friend, often bringing wildflower bouquets to the cottage or helping water the garden after school. "It's a magnificent pie," Nora assured her, admiring the perfectly crimped crust adorned with a blue ribbon. "Your mother must be very proud." "She is," Sally agreed solemnly, "but I want to be good with numbers like you when I grow up, not just baking." Warmth bloomed in Nora's chest at the child's declaration. "Well, there's no reason you can't excel at both," she said, smoothing Sally's unruly curls. "That's what I keep telling her," came a deep voice from behind them. "Though her arithmetic needs considerable work before she'll be keeping anyone's books." Ben stood there, looking so different from his usual appearance that Nora's breath caught. Instead of his working clothes and deputy's badge, he wore a crisp white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, though one rebellious lock had already fallen across his forehead. "You're one to talk, Uncle Ben," Sally retorted with the familiar impertinence of family. "Ma says you can barely add 2 and 2 without using your fingers." "Your mother," Ben replied with mock severity, "should mind her own arithmetic. Now scoot along, I see your friends by the lemonade." As Sally dashed off, Nora raised an eyebrow. "Uncle Ben, my sister's child," he explained. "Margaret married Jim Jenkins 5 years back. They run the assay office." "I didn't realize you had family in Wallace," Nora said, surprised by this new information. Born and raised here, Ben confirmed, offering her his arm as naturally as if he'd done so 100 times before. My father worked the first silver claims. Shall we walk? The music's about to start. They strolled through the festival, stopping to sample dishes, admire craftwork, and exchange pleasantries with townspeople. Nora was struck by how comfortable it felt to be at Ben's side, how easily they moved together through the crowd. As twilight approached, lanterns were lit and the musicians began a lively tune. Couples formed sets for dancing on the cleared ground before the platform, their faces glowing with enjoyment in the golden light. "Would you care to dance, Mrs. Wilson?" Ben asked, a hint of uncertainty beneath his confident demeanor. Nora hesitated. In St. Louis, she had attended countless society balls on Thomas's arm, each one a performance for his business associates and political connections. Dancing had become associated in her mind with pretense and fear of missteps that might trigger her husband's temper later. But this was different, a simple country dance among neighbors, with a man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. "I'd be honored, Deputy Garrett," she replied, placing her hand in his outstretched one. The dance was a Virginia reel, requiring them to join a line of couples. Ben guided her through the steps with surprising grace for such a tall man, his hand warm and steady when it met hers during the figures of the dance. Nora found herself laughing as they wove between the other dancers, caught up in the music and movement in a way she hadn't experienced since girlhood. When the music ended, they were both breathless and smiling. Without discussion, they sought the relative quiet of the edge of the square, finding a bench beneath an old maple tree strung with colorful lanterns. "You're quite the dancer, Mrs. Wilson," Ben remarked as they settled side by side. "I suspect that's not a skill one acquires keeping books in St. Louis." "My father believed in a well-rounded education," Nora replied, fanning herself with her handkerchief. "Though I'll admit I've rarely enjoyed dancing as much as I did just now." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, for Ben's expression grew thoughtful. "Your husband didn't approve of dancing. Thomas approved of nothing that brought me joy," Nora said before she could stop herself. The admission hung between them in the lantern-lit darkness. Ben was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. "I wish I had known you then, Nora. I wish I could have prevented what he did to you." The use of her first name and the raw emotion in his voice made her turn to look at him fully. In his face, she saw anger on her behalf, but also something deeper, more personal. "You know, don't you?" she asked softly. "Not just in general terms, you know what it is to watch someone you care about suffer that way." Ben's jaw tightened and he looked out across the festival grounds, not meeting her eyes. "My sister," he said finally. "Her first husband, before Jim," understanding dawned. "That's why you believe me without question. Why you were so ready to help." "Margaret was lucky," Ben continued, his voice tight with old rage. "He died in a mining accident before he could do permanent damage, but I saw what those 2 years did to her spirit." He turned back to Nora, his eyes fierce in the lantern light. "No one should have to endure that. No one." Without thinking, Nora placed her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them. "I'm sorry about your sister and grateful for your understanding." Ben's fingers interlaced with hers, warm and strong. "You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, Nora Wilson. To leave everything behind, to start again in a strange place that takes remarkable courage." "Or remarkable desperation," she countered with a self-deprecating smile. "Sometimes they're the same thing," Ben replied, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand that sent shivers up her arm. They sat in companionable silence, watching the dancers, their hands still joined on the bench. Nora felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with the security of her cottage or the absence of immediate threats. It was the peace of being truly seen and understood by another soul. The moment was broken by the sudden appearance of Ben's deputy, young Caleb Morris, who approached at a run. "Ben, sorry to interrupt, but there's trouble at the Lucky Strike Saloon. Miners and company men about to come to blows." Ben released Nora's hand reluctantly. "Duty calls," he said with a rueful smile. "May I escort you home first?" "Don't be silly," Nora replied, rising to her feet. "Go handle your emergency. I'm perfectly capable of walking to my cottage alone." He hesitated, torn between responsibility and concern. "Ben," she said firmly, "I've been taking care of myself for some time now. I'll be fine." "At least let Caleb see you home," Ben insisted. "The festivals brought strangers to town, and I'd rest easier knowing you arrived safely." Recognizing that this was a compromise worth accepting, Nora nodded. "Very well, but then he comes directly to assist you." "Yes, madam," Ben agreed with that almost smile that had become increasingly familiar. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll call on you tomorrow if I may." "I'll expect you for Sunday coffee as usual," Nora replied, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest at the thought. As she watched Ben stride purposefully toward the saloon district, Deputy Morris falling into step beside her, Nora acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. Somewhere between that first confrontation outside the saloon and tonight's dance beneath the lanterns, she had developed feelings for Ben Garrett that went far beyond gratitude or friendship. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying. She was still a married woman, legally bound to a monster hundreds of miles away. And even if she obtained the divorce Ben had mentioned, could she ever trust herself to love again after Thomas had so thoroughly destroyed her faith in her own judgment? Yet as she walked through the quiet streets toward her cottage, the festival sounds fading behind her, Nora found herself hoping with a ferocity that surprised her. Hoping that, perhaps, in this mountain town so far from her past, she might find not just safety but happiness as well. Ben did not appear for Sunday coffee the next day. Instead, a breathless Sally Jenkins arrived at Nora's cottage mid-morning with a note. "Uncle Ben asked me to bring this," the child announced importantly. "He's been up all night with the miners' trouble and can't leave the office yet." Nora unfolded the paper to find Ben's bold handwriting. "Nora, regrets for missing our coffee. The situation at the Lucky Strike is more complicated than anticipated and requires my full attention today. I hope to call on you tomorrow evening instead, if you'll permit it. With warmest regards." Ben, she penned a brief reply accepting his proposed visit and sent it back with Sally, who skipped away with the serious mission of a trusted messenger. Monday at the Mercantile brought a flurry of activity as miners' wives stocked up on supplies, their husbands having been locked out of the Lucky Strike mine following Saturday night's confrontation. Mr. Miller kept Nora apprised of developments as he heard them. "The mine owner brought in armed guards from Boise," he explained in hushed tones as they unpacked a shipment together. "Wants to replace the local men with cheaper labor from back east. Ben's been negotiating since Saturday night, trying to prevent bloodshed." "Is it dangerous?" Nora asked, unable to keep worry from her voice. Mr. Miller's shrewd eyes assessed her. "Ben Garrett's handled worse," he assured her. "He has a way of making men see reason even when they're determined not to." The day passed slowly, each hour stretching as Nora anticipated Ben's evening visit. She left work promptly at 5, hurrying home to tidy the cottage and prepare a simple supper in case Ben hadn't eaten. As twilight descended, she found herself checking her appearance in the mirror more often than necessary, smoothing her hair and adjusting the collar of her blue dress. When a knock finally came at her door just after 7, Nora's heart leaped then plummeted as she opened it to find not Ben but Deputy Morris, his young face grave in the gathering darkness. "Mrs. Wilson," he began awkwardly, twisting his hat in his hands. "Ben sent me to convey his apologies. There's been an incident at the mine, shots fired. No one's badly hurt," he added hastily, seeing her expression, "but Ben's got his hands full keeping order. He asked if you'd understand." "Of course," Nora replied, masking her disappointment. "Please tell him I hope the situation resolves quickly, and that he should take care of himself amidst all this trouble." Caleb nodded, clearly relieved by her understanding response. "He also asked me to check that your locks are secure, and to patrol past here a few times tonight, just as a precaution with all the strangers in town." After he'd gone, Nora tried to occupy herself with mending and reading, but her thoughts kept returning to Ben, imagining him standing between angry miners and equally angry mine owners, somehow maintaining peace through the force of his calm authority. She had just prepared for bed when another knock came, this one more hesitant. Wrapping her shawl around her nightdress, Nora approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" she called. "It's Ben," came the tired reply. She opened the door to find him looking utterly exhausted, his face smudged with dirt, his shirt torn at one shoulder. "I shouldn't have come so late," he said immediately, "but I wanted to explain in person why I couldn't make our appointment." "Please come in," Nora urged, standing aside. "Are you hurt?" "Just tired," Ben assured her, stepping into the warm light of her cottage. "And in dire need of washing up from the look on your face." Despite his attempt at humor, Nora could see the strain in the set of his shoulders and the lines around his eyes. "Sit," she ordered, gesturing to her small kitchen table. "I'll heat water for you to wash, and there's stew keeping warm on the stove." Too weary to argue, Ben sank into the chair, removing his hat and running a hand through his disheveled hair. As Nora busied herself heating water and ladling stew into a bowl, he watched her with an expression that might have disconcerted her had she noticed it, a look of quiet wonder, as if her simple domestic actions were somehow remarkable. "Here," she said, setting a basin of warm water before him along with a clean cloth. "Wash your hands and face while the stew cools enough to eat." Ben complied, the warm water turning gray as he scrubbed away the grime of his long day. When he was done, Nora handed him a towel and placed the bowl of stew before him. "Eat," she instructed. "Then you can tell me what's happening with the mine situation." The simple meal seemed to revive him. As Ben ate, some of the tension eased from his posture, and by the time he'd finished, he looked marginally less exhausted. "Better?" Nora asked, taking the empty bowl. "Much," Ben confirmed with a grateful smile. "I hadn't realized how hungry I was, thank you." "Now tell me about the mine," she prompted, taking the seat opposite him. Ben sighed, leaning back in his chair. "The owner, Harrington, brought in men from Chicago strikebreakers, really. The local miners got wind of it and confronted them Saturday night at the saloon. I managed to separate them then, but today Harrington tried to bring his new men up to the mine. And shots were fired," Nora completed the story. "Warning shots, thankfully," Ben clarified. "No one was aiming to hit, but it was enough to require intervention." He rubbed his eyes wearily. "I've convinced both sides to hold off until the territorial governor's representative arrives to mediate. He should be here by Wednesday's stage. And until then, I keep the peace," Ben said simply, "which means very little sleep for me or my deputies." Nora studied him across the table, noting the shadows beneath his eyes and the day's growth of beard darkening his jaw. "You should rest," she said softly. "I should," he agreed, making no move to leave. "But this is the first moment of peace I've had all day, and I find I'm reluctant to surrender it just yet." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the cottage quiet around them except for the occasional pop from the small stove and Tiger's contented purring from his place on the rug. "I've been thinking," Ben said finally, his tone thoughtful, "about what happens after this mine dispute is settled." "Oh," Nora prompted when he didn't immediately continue. "Yes." He leaned forward, his gray eyes intent on hers. "Nora, I know your situation is complicated. I know there are legal and personal hurdles still before you, but I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would very much like to court you properly." The directness of his statement took her breath away. "Ben, he held up a hand. "You don't need to answer now. In fact, I'd rather you didn't. With everything unsettled, it wouldn't be fair to either of us." His expression softened. "I just wanted you to know where I stand, and to assure you that I'm willing to wait as long as necessary." Emotion constricted Nora's throat, making speech impossible. That this good, honorable man would declare himself to her, would offer her a future she had thought forever closed to her, seemed almost too miraculous to comprehend. Ben rose from the table, clearly reading her emotional turmoil. "I should go. My deputies will be wondering where I've disappeared to." Nora stood as well, finding her voice at last. "Ben, wait." She moved around the table to stand before him, gathering her courage. "I can't make promises about the future, but I want you to know that your regard means more to me than I can express, and that if circumstances were different." She trailed off, unsure how to complete the thought without making promises she might not be able to keep. Ben's smile held understanding and something more, a warmth that reached all the way to his eyes. "That's more than enough for now," he assured her. Impulsively, Nora rose on tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, her lips brushing against the roughness of his stubble. "Be careful," she whispered. "Wallace needs you in one piece." "I will," he promised, his voice rougher than before. Then, with a final look that made her heart race, he departed into the night, leaving Nora standing in her doorway with her fingers pressed to lips that still tingled from their brief contact with his skin. The next 2 days passed in a blur of tension as Wallace held its collective breath, waiting for the governor's representative to arrive. Ben was a constant presence in town, moving between the miners' camp and the mine owner's headquarters at the hotel, ensuring that the fragile truce held. Nora caught glimpses of him as she went about her work at the Mercantile, striding purposefully down Main Street, deep in conversation with mining officials, or conferring with his deputies outside the makeshift jail. Though he didn't have time to call on her again, he somehow managed to send brief notes via Sally Jenkins, keeping her informed of developments and assuring her of his well-being. Wednesday dawned clear and bright, with a hint of coolness that suggested autumn was truly approaching. The stage was due at noon, bringing the territorial official who would hopefully resolve the mining dispute before it erupted into violence. As the appointed hour approached, most of the town gravitated toward the stage depot. Mr. Miller closed the Mercantile early, declaring that historic events warranted attention. Nora accompanied him and Mrs. Miller to the depot, where a sizable crowd had already gathered. The miners stood in a group to one side, their expressions grim but determined. Opposite them, the mine owner and his Chicago men maintained a studied indifference that didn't quite mask their tension. Between the two factions stood Ben and his deputies, creating a buffer zone of neutral territory. Nora's heart quickened at the sight of Ben in his official capacity, tall and commanding, his badge catching the sunlight as he conferred with the stage depot manager. Though he must have been exhausted after days with minimal sleep, he showed no sign of weakness, his posture straight, his movements decisive. As if sensing her presence, Ben looked up, his eyes finding hers across the crowd. For a brief moment, his serious expression softened into something more personal before he returned his attention to his duties. The sound of the approaching stage interrupted the tense atmosphere. As the coach rounded the corner onto Main Street, a collective murmur rose from the assembled crowd. The future of Wallace's largest employer and the livelihoods of dozens of families would likely be determined by whoever stepped down from that dusty vehicle. The stage rolled to a stop amid a cloud of dust, the driver setting the brake with a practiced motion. The depot manager moved forward to open the door, and the crowd held its breath as a distinguished-looking gentleman in a tailored suit descended. "Judge Harding," someone exclaimed in surprise. The circuit judge nodded in acknowledgement, turning to assist another passenger, a younger man with a portfolio tucked under his arm who must be the governor's representative. But it was the third passenger who drew Nora's attention and turned her blood to ice. Thomas Blackwell stepped down from the stage, his handsome face set in the charming smile that had once captivated her. He wore an expensive traveling suit that showed no sign of the journey's dust, and his dark hair was perfectly arranged beneath his fashionable hat. Nora couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only watch in horror as her husband surveyed the crowd with the confident air of a man who expected to be obeyed. Thomas's gaze swept the gathering, clearly searching. When his eyes found Nora, his smile widened into the expression she had come to dread, satisfaction mingled with cold determination. Her instinct was to run, but her legs seemed rooted to the ground. Around her, the townspeople continued to focus on the official proceedings, unaware of the personal drama unfolding in their midst. Then Thomas began moving toward her, cutting through the crowd with practiced ease. Panic clawed at Nora's throat as he approached, memories of pain and terror flooding her mind. "Nora," Thomas greeted her, his voice carrying that silky quality that had always preceded his worst rages. "How delightful to find you waiting for me. Robert said you'd found quite the rustic hideaway." Mr. Miller stepped protectively closer to Nora's side. "Can we help you, sir?" he asked, his normally friendly face hardening with suspicion. Thomas's smile didn't waver. "No need, my good man. I'm simply reuniting with my wayward wife." He extended a hand toward Nora. "Come, darling. We have a great deal to discuss." Nora flinched away from his touch, finding her voice at last. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Thomas." His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Don't make a scene, Nora," he warned, lowering his voice. "You know how that displeases me." "The lady said she's not going with you," Mr. Miller stated firmly. "I suggest you respect her wishes." Thomas's charm vanished, replaced by the cold anger Nora knew so well. "This is a private matter between husband and wife," he snapped. "Step aside." "No," came a deep voice from behind Thomas. "It's a matter for the law now." Ben stood there, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol. Despite the chaos of the mining situation, he had somehow noticed Thomas's arrival and Nora's distress. Thomas turned, sizing up this new obstacle with practiced calculation. "And you are Deputy Ben Garrett," Ben replied evenly. "And you must be Thomas Blackwell." A flicker of surprise crossed Thomas's face before he masked it. "I am, and I'm here to collect my wife who left St. Louis without my permission some months ago." "Mrs. Wilson isn't going anywhere she doesn't wish to go," Ben stated, emphasizing Nora's chosen name. "Not while I'm responsible for keeping the peace in Wallace." The crowd around them had begun to take notice of the confrontation, attention diverted from the mining officials. Even Judge Harding was watching with interest from the depot platform. Thomas's expression darkened. "I have legal rights, Deputy." She is my wife under the laws of Missouri and every other state in the Union. Perhaps, Ben acknowledged, but we do things differently in Idaho territory. Here, a woman's safety takes precedence over a man's property claims. A murmur of approval rippled through the growing audience. Thomas changed tactics, his voice becoming reasonable, even concerned. I understand your position, Deputy, but my wife has been unwell. Delusions, emotional instability, her doctors in St. Louis were quite concerned. I've come to bring her home for proper care. The blatant lie stunned Nora. That's not true, she protested, stepping forward despite her fear. Thomas is lying. He's the one who needs medical attention for the uncontrollable rages that left me fearing for my life. Thomas's face contorted with genuine anger now, the mask of civility slipping. You ungrateful, he cut himself off, aware of the many witnesses. Nora, darling, you're only proving my point about your condition. I think I've heard enough, Ben said, his voice deceptively calm. Mr. Blackwell, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to my office, where we can discuss this matter privately. This is absurd, Thomas blustered. I demand you release my wife into my custody immediately. Ben moved with unexpected swiftness, his hand closing around Thomas's upper arm in a grip that, while not overtly violent, was clearly immovable. That wasn't a request, Mr. Blackwell. For a moment, it seemed Thomas might resist physically. Then, with a cold smile, he relaxed. Very well, Deputy. Let's discuss this like civilized men. As Ben began to lead Thomas away, Judge Harding stepped forward from the depot platform. Deputy Garrett, he called. Bring Mr. Blackwell to the hotel dining room in 1 hour. I believe this is a matter that falls under my jurisdiction, and I'd like to hear all sides before making any determinations. Ben nodded his acknowledgement, continuing to guide Thomas firmly toward the jail. Nora stood trembling in the aftermath, scarcely able to believe what had just occurred. Thomas had found her. After all her precautions, all her running, he had simply stepped off the stage into her new life, threatening to destroy everything. Come, dear, Mrs. Miller said gently, taking Nora's arm. Let's get you somewhere quiet to collect yourself before you have to face that man again. He'll never let me go, Nora whispered, allowing herself to be led away from the curious crowd. Thomas always gets what he wants, one way or another. Not this time, Mrs. Miller declared with surprising fierceness. Not with Ben Garrett and the whole town of Wallace standing against him. An hour later, Nora sat in the hotel dining room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to prevent them from visibly shaking. Judge Harding had cleared the space of other patrons, creating an impromptu courtroom for what he termed a preliminary hearing into the matter of Mrs. Wilson's status. Ben had arranged for Margaret Jenkins to sit with Nora, providing both moral support and the respectable presence of a married woman. Thomas sat at another table, his composure fully restored, occasionally casting confident smiles in Nora's direction that made her stomach churn with dread. Judge Harding called the informal proceedings to order, his manner brisk but not unkind. This is an unusual situation, he began, but one that requires immediate attention given the circumstances. Mr. Blackwell claims the right to compel his wife to return with him to Missouri. Mrs. Wilson, or Mrs. Blackwell, as her husband names her wishes to remain in Wallace under her chosen identity. Deputy Garrett has raised concerns about Mrs. Wilson's safety should she return with her husband. The judge turned to Thomas. Mr. Blackwell, please state your case briefly. Thomas rose, the picture of aggrieved dignity. Your Honor, this is a simple matter of family law. Nora is my lawfully wedded wife, as our marriage certificate proves. He placed a document on the table before the judge. She left our home without my consent while suffering from nervous exhaustion following her father's death. I've spent months searching for her out of concern for her well-being." He continued smoothly, painting a picture of Nora as fragile and unstable, himself as the devoted husband seeking only her best interests. It was a masterful performance, one that had convinced many in St. Louis society that Thomas Blackwell was a model spouse, burdened with a difficult wife. When he finished, Judge Harding nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Nora. "Mrs. Wilson, would you care to respond to your husband's claims?" Nora rose on unsteady legs, feeling as though she might faint. But as she looked around the room at Ben's steady gaze, at Margaret Jenkins's encouraging nod, at the judge's impartial attention, something within her strengthened. "Your Honor," she began, her voice low but clear, "everything my husband has told you is a lie designed to conceal the true nature of our marriage." Taking a deep breath, she continued, "Thomas Blackwell is a violent man who has beaten me repeatedly throughout our 2-year marriage, most recently to the point where I feared for my life." Thomas made a sound of outraged protest, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "The bruises would heal," Nora continued, finding courage in finally speaking the truth aloud, "but he took care never to leave marks where they would show in public. He controlled every aspect of my life, whom I could speak to, where I could go, how I could dress. When I finally fled St. Louis, I was acting not out of mental instability, but out of the very rational fear that I would not survive another year as his wife." She gestured toward Ben. "Deputy Garrett can attest to the state I was in when I arrived in Wallace, still bearing the marks of my husband's last attack." "This is slander," Thomas interrupted, unable to contain himself. "My wife was prone to accidents, clumsiness, falls. Any marks she bore were self-inflicted or the result of her own carelessness." "Mr. Blackwell," Judge Harding said sternly, "you will have your opportunity to rebut these claims. For now, I ask you to remain silent." Nora continued, recounting specific incidents of abuse with a composure that surprised even her. She described the isolation Thomas had enforced, the financial control he had exerted, and finally, the brutal attack that had driven her to flee west with only what she could carry. When she finished, the room was silent except for the soft sound of Margaret Jenkins's sympathetic weeping. Judge Harding turned to Ben. "Deputy Garrett, you indicated you have relevant testimony." Ben stood, his expression grave. "I do, Your Honor. When Mrs. Wilson arrived in Wallace in June, she bore a visible bruise on her face and other marks consistent with the abuse she has described. Furthermore, approximately 3 weeks ago, Mr. Blackwell's brother Robert came to Wallace seeking Mrs. Wilson. His manner was threatening enough that I deemed it necessary to escort him onto the eastbound stage to protect Mrs. Wilson's safety." "These claims are outrageous," Thomas interjected, his cultured voice taking on an edge of desperation. "My brother was simply trying to locate my missing wife. As for these alleged bruises, Nora has always bruised easily, a medical condition her physician in St. Louis can confirm." "I also have this," Ben continued, ignoring the interruption. From his pocket, he withdrew a folded paper which he presented to the judge. "A telegram from the St. Louis Police Department in response to my inquiry. It confirms that officers were called to the Blackwell residence on multiple occasions by neighbors reporting disturbances, though no charges were ever filed." Thomas paled visibly. "Those were domestic misunderstandings, nothing more." Judge Harding studied the telegram, his expression grave. After a thoughtful pause, he addressed the room. "This is a serious matter with significant legal complexities. While I am sympathetic to Mrs. Wilson's situation, the fact remains that under current law, Marriage is a binding contract that cannot be easily set aside. He held up a hand as Nora's heart sank. However, Idaho territory does recognize extreme cruelty as grounds for legal separation and potentially divorce. He turned to Thomas, his gaze steely. "Mr. Blackwell, given the testimony I've heard and the supporting evidence, I am issuing a temporary restraining order preventing you from approaching or attempting to remove Mrs. Wilson from Wallace pending a full hearing into this matter. This is outrageous." Thomas exploded, his carefully maintained facade crumbling. "She is my wife, my property." "That last statement," Judge Harding observed dryly, "does your case no favors, Mr. Blackwell. I'll add that any attempt to violate this order will result in your immediate arrest." "You can't do this," Thomas insisted, his voice taking on the dangerous quality Nora knew so well. "I have connections in the territorial government. This won't stand." "You're welcome to appeal my ruling through proper channels," the judge replied calmly. "Until then, you will remain at least 100 yards from Mrs. Wilson at all times. Deputy Garrett, I trust you'll enforce this order." "With pleasure, Your Honor," Ben confirmed, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Thomas's gaze shifted to Nora, and the naked hatred in his expression made her shiver despite the warm room. "This isn't over," he promised softly. "Not by a long shot." As the gathering dispersed, Ben moved immediately to Nora's side. "I'll escort you home," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "And arrange for deputies to keep watch on your cottage until Blackwell leaves town." "He won't leave," Nora replied, her earlier courage giving way to bone-deep weariness. "Not when he's so close to reclaiming what he considers his possession." "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," Ben assured her, his hand warm on her elbow as he guided her from the hotel. "For now, let's get you home." The walk to Nora's cottage was silent, both of them processing the events of the afternoon. As they approached her gate, Ben finally spoke. "Nora, I want you to know how proud I am of you, of your courage in speaking the truth today. Many women in your situation never find the strength to do what you did." His words warmed a cold place in her heart. "I couldn't have done it without knowing you were there," she admitted. "Without feeling that someone believed me." Ben's expression softened. "Not just someone, an entire town." "You've made a place for yourself here, Nora. These people won't let Blackwell take you without a fight." At her door, Ben checked the locks and windows before assuring himself that all was secure. "I'll have a deputy outside all night," he promised. "Try to rest if you can." Impulsively, Nora caught his hand as he turned to go. "Ben," she said softly, "thank you for everything." His fingers tightened around hers. "I told you once that you'd be protected here," he reminded her. "That hasn't changed." With a gentle squeeze, he released her hand and departed, leaving Nora to the quiet sanctuary of her cottage. But as she prepared for bed that night, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's arrival had set in motion events that would not be easily resolved, that the peace she had found in Wallace hung by a thread that her husband would gladly sever with one vicious pull. The restraining order did little to calm Nora's fears. In the week following Thomas's arrival, she found herself jumping at shadows, startling at unexpected sounds, and peering nervously over her shoulder as she walked between the mercantile and her cottage. Though Ben had assigned deputies to patrol near her home and escort her when possible, she knew they couldn't watch her every moment. Thomas, meanwhile, had taken a room at the hotel and established himself as a visiting businessman interested in local investment opportunities. He obeyed the letter of the judge's order, never coming within the prescribed 100 yards of Nora, but she often felt his eyes on her from a distance as she moved about town. "He's waiting for his chance," she confided to Ben one evening as they sat on her porch. Deputy Morris kept discreet watch from the street, ensuring Thomas didn't violate the restraining order. "I know him, Ben. He'll find a way to get to me eventually." "Not while I'm here," Ben assured her, though she could see the concern beneath his confident words. "Judge Harding has scheduled the formal hearing for next week. Once he reviews all the evidence, he'll likely grant your petition for legal separation." "And if he doesn't?" Nora asked, giving voice to her deepest fear. "If the law requires me to return to Thomas," Ben's expression hardened. "Then we'll find another solution," he said with quiet intensity. "I won't let him take you back to that life, Nora. I promise you that." The mining dispute had been temporarily resolved through the governor's representative, giving Ben more time to focus on Nora's security. He had taken to spending his evenings on her porch when his duties allowed, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence as darkness settled over the little town. These quiet moments had become precious to Nora, anchors of normalcy in the storm of anxiety that Thomas's presence had created. Despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, her feelings for Ben had continued to deepen, evolving from cautious attraction to something that felt dangerously like love. Yet she kept these feelings carefully contained, unwilling to burden Ben further or to make promises she might not be able to keep. Until Thomas was no longer a threat, until her legal status was resolved, any declaration would be premature. Saturday morning dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds hanging low over the mountains. Nora prepared for work with her usual care, grateful that Mr. Miller had insisted she continue her position despite Thomas's accusations about her mental state. "The books don't lie," he had declared stoutly, "and yours are the most meticulously kept I've ever seen. No one with an unstable mind could produce work like that." As Nora walked to the mercantile, escorted by young Deputy Morris, fat raindrops began to spatter the dusty street, quickly turning to a steady downpour. By noon, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming on the mercantile's roof and discouraging all but the most determined customers. "This will keep up all day," Mr. Miller predicted, peering through the streaked windows at the deserted street. "Why don't you head home early, Mrs. Wilson? No sense in both of us sitting here watching the rain." Nora hesitated, reluctant to leave the safety of the store. "I should finish the monthly statements," she demurred. "They can wait till Monday," Mr. Miller insisted. "Go on home and enjoy a quiet afternoon with that book I saw you bring in this morning." Unable to argue with his logic and admittedly tempted by the thought of reading by the fire while the rain beat against her windows, Nora gathered her belongings. Deputy Morris had been called away an hour earlier to help with a fallen tree on Cedar Street, but Mr. Miller insisted on walking her home himself, holding an enormous black umbrella over them both. They were halfway to her cottage when Nora spotted a familiar figure huddled in the doorway of the closed photography studio, apparently sheltering from the rain. Thomas saw them at the same moment, his eyes fixing on Nora with an intensity that made her falter mid-step. "Steady," Mr. Miller murmured, guiding her forward with a firm hand on her elbow. "He can't approach within 100 yards, remember?" Nora nodded, forcing herself to continue walking. Thomas remained in the doorway, watching them pass, his expression unreadable through the curtain of rain. She felt his gaze on her back long after they had turned the corner toward her cottage. "I don't like leaving you alone with that man in town," Mr. Miller fretted as they reached her gate. "Perhaps I should send for Ben to come check on you." "Ben has enough to worry about," Nora replied, touched by his concern. "I'll be fine. The doors are sturdy and I'll keep them locked." After seeing Mr. Miller off, Nora secured her cottage and changed into dry clothes, trying to shake the chill that had settled into her bones at the sight of Thomas watching her from the shadows. She built up the fire, made tea, and settled into the armchair with her book, determined not to let fear rob her of a peaceful afternoon. Outside, the rain continued unabated, drumming hypnotically on the roof and windows. The cozy warmth of the cottage, combined with her interrupted sleep the night before, soon had Nora nodding over her book. She didn't remember closing her eyes, but she must have dozed off, for she awoke with a start to the sound of breaking glass. For a disoriented moment, Nora thought the noise was part of a dream. Then she heard it again, the distinctive sound of a window being forced open in the back of the cottage. Heart pounding, she rose silently from the chair, looking frantically for a weapon. The poker by the fireplace was the closest thing at hand. She seized it, her palms slick with fear as she moved toward the small hallway that led to her bedroom, where the sound had originated. "No need for dramatics, Nora," came Thomas's voice, smooth and confident. He stepped from her bedroom into the hallway, blocking her path to the front door. "I only want to talk." "You're violating the restraining order," Nora said, hating the tremor in her voice as she gripped the poker tighter. "Get out before I scream for help." Thomas smiled, that particular smile that never reached his eyes. "Scream all you like. The rain will muffle it, and your nearest neighbor is the empty schoolhouse." He took a step toward her. "Besides, I'm merely visiting my wife in the privacy of her home." "How was I to know you didn't want my company?" "Stay back," Nora warned, raising the poker. "I'll use this if I have to." "No, you won't," Thomas replied with maddening certainty. "You've never had the spine for real confrontation, Nora. It's why you ran instead of facing me directly. It's why you've hidden in this backwater behind that deputy of yours, instead of dealing with your marital responsibilities like a proper wife." Each word was calculated to undermine her confidence, to remind her of her powerlessness during their marriage. Nora felt herself beginning to crumble beneath the familiar assault. "What do you want, Thomas?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What's rightfully mine," he replied, his smile vanishing. "You humiliated me with your lies in front of that judge. You've made me waste valuable time tracking you across the country. Now it's time to come home and face the consequences of your actions." He stepped closer, and Nora retreated until her back pressed against the wall of the small hallway. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she insisted, though her voice shook. "Ben will be here soon. He checks on me every afternoon. Garrett is currently occupied with a disturbance at the other end of town," Thomas informed her with smug satisfaction. Something about a drunken miner threatening violence. Most convenient timing. With horror, Nora realized the trap had been carefully set, the rain keeping most people indoors, Deputy Morris called away, and now Ben diverted by what was almost certainly a distraction arranged by Thomas. "You can't force me to leave," she said, raising the poker as he advanced another step. "I'll fight you every inch of the way." "Oh, I don't intend to take you anywhere just yet," Thomas replied, his voice dropping to that silky tone she remembered from her worst nights in St. Louis. "First, we need to re-establish our understanding. You seem to have forgotten who holds the power in our marriage." He moved with the swiftness that had always caught her off guard, closing the distance between them and knocking the poker from her hands in one smooth motion. His fingers closed around her wrist with bruising force, twisting her arm behind her back as he pushed her against the wall. "There," he murmured against her ear, his breath hot on her skin. "Isn't this familiar? Just like old times." Nora struggled against his grip, panic rising in her throat. "Let go of me." "Not until you've learned your lesson," Thomas replied, increasing the pressure on her arm until she cried out in pain. "You belong to me, Nora. No judge's order, no small town deputy, and no amount of running will change that fact. As her vision blurred with tears of pain and fear, something shifted within Nora, a tectonic movement of her spirit. She had spent 2 years in terror of this man, another 3 months looking over her shoulder in fear of his pursuit. She had fled across the country, changed her name, and rebuilt her life from nothing. And now he stood in the home she had made for herself, threatening to destroy everything once again. "No," she said, the word emerging with unexpected force. "No more, Thomas." With strength born of desperation and fury, Nora drove her heel down hard on his instep, simultaneously throwing her head back to connect with his face. Thomas howled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench free. She dove for the fallen poker, rolling to her feet with the iron rod clutched in both hands. Thomas stood before her, blood streaming from his nose, his handsome face contorted with rage. "You little bitch," he snarled, all pretense of civilized behavior abandoned. "I'll teach you to strike your husband," he lunged for her, but Nora was ready this time. She swung the poker with all her strength, catching him across the shoulder. The impact sent shock waves up her arms, but Thomas staggered back, momentarily stunned by the blow. "Get out of my house," Nora demanded, brandishing the poker before her. "Get out and never come back." Thomas's eyes narrowed to slits, calculation replacing blind rage. "You've become quite the wildcat in my absence," he observed, dabbing at his bloody nose with a handkerchief. "But this changes nothing. You're still my wife under the law, and one way or another, you're coming back to St. Louis with me." "The law is changing," Nora countered, not lowering her makeshift weapon. "Judge Harding will grant my petition for separation and eventually divorce." "You'll have no claim on me then." Thomas's laugh held no humor. "You think that old fool's ruling will stand once my attorneys get involved? I own judges in 3 states, Nora. One territorial appointment is nothing." "This isn't St. Louis," Nora reminded him, echoing Ben's words. "Your money and connections mean nothing here. We'll see about that." Thomas straightened his jacket, composing himself with visible effort. "I'll go for now, but this isn't over, Nora, not even close." He backed toward the bedroom and the broken window through which he had entered, keeping his eyes on her and the poker she still held at the ready. "Enjoy your temporary freedom," he called over his shoulder. "It won't last." Only when she heard the squelch of his footsteps retreating through the muddy yard did Nora allow herself to collapse, the poker clattering to the floor as she sank to her knees. Her entire body shook with reaction, tears streaming down her face unchecked. She didn't know how long she knelt there before the pounding on her front door startled her back to awareness. "Nora, are you in there? Nora," Ben's voice frantic with concern. On trembling legs, she rose and made her way to the door, fumbling with the lock before pulling it open to reveal Ben standing in the pouring rain, his face pale with worry. "Thank God," he breathed, stepping inside. "I came as soon as I could." The disturbance at the mine was a false alarm, and I had a feeling. He stopped abruptly, taking in her disheveled appearance and tear-streaked face. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Thomas was here," Nora said, her voice hollow with shock. "He broke in through the bedroom window." Ben's expression darkened to thunderous rage. "Did he hurt you?" he tried, Nora replied, touching her wrist where bruises were already forming. "But I fought back this time. I hit him with the fireplace poker." For a moment Ben looked torn between pride and fury. "Where is he now?" "Gone." "He left through the same window." Nora shivered, the reality of what had happened beginning to sink in fully. "Ben, he planned this carefully, the rain, the false emergency to draw you away. He's not going to stop." "He will if I have anything to say about it," Ben growled, moving to examine the broken window. After ensuring it was securely blocked with a piece of furniture, he returned to Nora, his expression softening as he took in her trembling form. "Come here," he said gently, opening his arms. Without hesitation, Nora stepped into his embrace, burying her face against his chest as his strong arms encircled her. For the first time since Thomas's arrival in Wallace, she allowed herself to fully release the fear and tension she had been carrying, sobbing against Ben's shirt while he held her securely, murmuring reassurances against her hair. When her tears finally subsided, Ben led her to the small sofa before the fire, keeping one arm around her shoulders as they sat. "I'm taking you to Margaret's house tonight," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You can't stay here with that window broken, and I need to find Blackwell before he tries something else." "What will you do when you find him?" Nora asked, suddenly concerned. "Ben, he's still my husband legally." "If you hurt him, I'm an officer of the law," Ben reminded her, though the hard set of his jaw suggested he was tempted to forget that fact. "I'll arrest him for violating the restraining order and breaking and entering. Judge Harding can deal with him from there." He brushed a strand of hair from her face with unexpected tenderness. "But make no mistake, Nora. If he had seriously hurt you, badge or no badge, I would have made him pay for it." The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed her despite her lingering fear. "I think I did make him pay, at least a little," she admitted with a watery smile. "His nose was bleeding quite impressively when he left." Ben's answering smile held grim satisfaction. "Good. Now let's get you to Margaret's. Pack what you'll need for a few days while I arrange for the window to be properly repaired." As they stepped out into the rain a short while later, Ben's arm secure around her waist and her small valise in his other hand, Nora felt a curious mixture of fear and determination. Thomas had found her, had violated her sanctuary, but she had fought back, had stood up to the man who had terrorized her for so long. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage. And she would not face it alone. The days that followed brought a flurry of activity. Thomas was nowhere to be found when Ben organized a search party, having apparently fled Wallace after his confrontation with Nora. His room at the hotel had been hastily abandoned, personal items left behind suggesting a rapid departure. "He's likely headed back to St. Louis to regroup," Ben theorized as they sat in Margaret Jenkins's cozy kitchen the morning after the attack, "or possibly to consult with attorneys about challenging Judge Harding's ruling. Or to gather more men to help him," Nora suggested grimly. "Thomas doesn't accept defeat easily." "Neither do I," Ben replied, covering her hand with his where it rested on the table. "And I have the advantage of home territory." The formal hearing before Judge Harding proceeded as scheduled, with Nora presenting evidence of Thomas's abuse and his recent violation of the restraining order. Without Thomas present to contest her claims, the judge ruled decisively in her favor. "I hereby grant Mrs. Nora Wilson's petition for legal separation from Thomas Blackwell," he announced from behind the makeshift bench in the town hall. "Furthermore, I am issuing preliminary divorce proceedings to be finalized in 6 months' time, as prescribed by territorial statute." A cheer went up from the assembled townspeople, many of whom had attended to show their support for Nora. She sat stunned, scarcely able to believe that freedom, legal freedom, was finally within her grasp. "It's really happening," she whispered to Ben, who sat beside her, his face alight with satisfaction at the judge's ruling. "After everything, I'm almost free of him." "You deserve every happiness, Nora," Ben replied softly, his gray eyes holding a promise that made her heart beat faster. The following days brought a return to something resembling normalcy. The window in Nora's cottage was repaired, additional locks installed, and after a week at Margaret's insistence, Nora returned to her own home, though now with Tiger plus a large dog named Rusty whom Ben had procured. For additional security, he claimed, though Nora suspected he simply thought she might enjoy the animal's companionship. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the vibrant colors of autumn in the surrounding mountains. The new schoolmistress had found other accommodation, allowing Nora to remain in the cottage indefinitely. Work at the mercantile continued to provide satisfaction and stability, while her friendships within the community deepened with each passing day. Thomas remained absent, though Nora couldn't quite believe he had given up entirely. Ben maintained discreet vigilance, having deputies patrol near her cottage regularly and escorting her himself whenever possible. These walks together, whether to church on Sundays or home from the mercantile in the evenings, became precious opportunities for conversation and connection. They spoke of books, of Wallace's future as the silver mines expanded, of Ben's childhood in the mountains and Nora's in the more civilized confines of St. Louis. Gradually, cautiously, their relationship evolved beyond protector and protected to something more equal, more profound. Ben began calling on Nora formally several evenings a week, bringing small gifts, wildflowers gathered from the hillside, a book of poetry he had ordered from boys, once even a silver bracelet crafted by the town silversmith. "It's not much," he said almost shyly as he fastened it around her wrist, "but I wanted you to have something beautiful made from Wallace silver." "It's perfect," Nora assured him, touched beyond words by the thoughtful gesture. One crisp October evening, with the first dusting of snow visible on the highest peaks, Ben invited Nora for a ride to his favorite spot in the mountains above town. They set out in Ben's buggy just after lunch, climbing steadily up a winding road that offered increasingly spectacular views of the valley below. "It's breathtaking," Nora exclaimed as they reached a clearing that provided a panoramic vista of Wallace nestled in its mountain cradle, the buildings looking like toys from such a height. "I come here when I need perspective," Ben explained, helping her down from the buggy. "When the problems in town seem overwhelming, this place reminds me how small they really are in the grand scheme of things." They walked to a flat-topped boulder at the edge of the clearing, where Ben spread a blanket he had brought. Sitting side by side, they shared the picnic. Margaret had packed cold chicken, fresh bread, apple tarts, and a bottle of good wine that Ben poured into tin cups with an apologetic smile for the lack of proper glassware. As the afternoon sun bathed the mountains in golden light, Nora felt a contentment she had thought forever beyond her reach. Here, with Ben beside her and the world spread out below, the shadow of Thomas Blackwell seemed to recede to a distant memory. "I've been thinking," Ben said after a comfortable silence, his voice taking on an unusual note of uncertainty, "about the future." Nora turned to look at him, struck as always by the quiet strength in his features and the warmth in his gray eyes. "What about it?" "Your divorce will be final in February," he continued, picking up a small stone and turning it absently in his fingers. "And I was wondering what you plan to do afterward." "Do?" Nora echoed, not following his meaning. "Will you stay in Wallace?" Ben clarified, his gaze fixed on the valley below. "Or would you prefer to make a fresh start somewhere else, somewhere without the memories of Thomas's visit?" Understanding dawned. "Are you asking if I intend to leave?" "I suppose I am," Ben admitted, finally meeting her eyes. "I hope you won't, but I would understand if you felt the need to move on." Nora considered the question seriously. In the months since she had arrived in Wallace, this mountain town had transformed from a hiding place to a home. She had work that satisfied her, friends who supported her, and a sense of belonging she had thought lost forever after her father's death. And she had Ben's steadfast, honorable Ben, who had protected her without smothering her independence, who had seen her courage when she herself had forgotten it existed. "Wallace is my home now," she said simply. "I have no desire to leave it or the people in it." The relief in Ben's expression was palpable. "I'm very glad to hear that," he said, reaching for her hand, "because I've been wanting to ask you something else." Nora's heart quickened as Ben set aside his cup and turned to face her fully on the blanket. "What is it?" "I know your experience with marriage has been." He hesitated, searching for words, traumatic, and I would understand completely if you never wished to enter that state again. He took both her hands in his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "But I love you, Nora Wilson. I think I've loved you since that first day when you stood in Miller's store, trying so hard to be invisible while your spirit shone like a beacon to anyone with eyes to see." Emotion closed Nora's throat, making speech impossible as Ben continued. "I don't want to rush you, and I'll wait as long as necessary. But when your divorce is final, when you're truly free, I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." His smile turned self-deprecating. "I can't offer wealth or social position like Blackwell, but I promise you this. You would be cherished, respected, and absolutely safe for all the days of your life." Tears spilled onto Nora's cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Ben," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't need wealth or position. I just need your kindness, your strength, your unwavering support." She squeezed his hands, finding courage in the answering pressure of his fingers. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since you stood between me and Thomas at the stage depot and said I was under your protection." Ben's face lit with a joy that took her breath away. "Is that a yes?" he asked, hardly daring to believe. "Yes," Nora confirmed, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you, Ben Garrett, as soon as I am legally able to do so." With reverent tenderness, Ben cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly, his eyes searching hers for any hint of hesitation or fear. In answer, Nora leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers with exquisite gentleness, the kiss speaking of promises kept and a future filled with love rather than fear. When they finally drew apart, the sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Ben wrapped his arm around Nora's shoulders, drawing her close against his side as they watched darkness creep into the valley below. "We should head back before we lose the light," he said reluctantly. "Just a few minutes more," Nora requested, unwilling to break the spell of this perfect moment. "I want to remember everything about this day." They descended the mountain as the first stars appeared, the buggy's lantern lighting their way through the gathering darkness. In town, windows glowed with lamplight and the sounds of a normal evening in Wallace piano music from the saloon, laughter from the hotel dining room. The distant bark of a dog welcomed them back to civilization. At Nora's cottage, Ben helped her down from the buggy, but instead of bidding her good night at the gate as usual, he walked her to the door. "I'd like to make an announcement at church on Sunday, if you're comfortable with that," he said, still holding her hand. "People will talk anyway once they see the way I look at you, knowing I can finally call you mine." Nora smiled at the possessiveness in his tone, so different from Thomas's toxic ownership. Ben's claim was one of devotion, not domination. "I'd like that," she agreed, then added with a touch of mischief, "Mrs. Miller will be insufferably pleased with herself. She's been hinting about us for weeks." Ben laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet evening. "Half the town has been placing bets on when I'd finally get up the nerve to propose. I believe Marshall Porter had money on Christmas." He kissed her once more, tenderly but with a hint of passion that promised deeper feeling carefully restrained. "Good night, my love. Dream of spring weddings and our future together." "Good night, Ben," Nora replied softly. "Thank you for today for everything." As she prepared for bed that night, Nora found herself humming a melody her father used to play on the piano, a song of joy and homecoming. For the first time in years, her future stretched before her not as a fearful uncertainty, but as a path filled with promise and possibility. Thomas Blackwell's shadow might never completely disappear from her life, but it had receded enough to let the light shine through the light of community, of purpose, and most of all, of Ben's steady love. Winter settled over Wallace with a heavy hand, bringing deep snow and bitter cold that transformed the mountain town into a glittering wonderland. Despite the harsh conditions, Nora found unexpected joy in the season, in cozy evenings by the fire with Ben, in community gatherings at the church, in the simple pleasures of hot chocolate shared with Sally Jenkins and her friends who had adopted Nora as a favorite adult. Ben and Nora's engagement was received with enthusiastic approval throughout Wallace. Wedding plans progressed steadily, with a date set for the first Saturday in March, 2 weeks after Nora's divorce would become final according to Judge Harding's decree. Margaret Jenkins insisted on hosting the ceremony and celebration at her spacious home, while Mrs. Miller coordinated the sewing of a wedding dress that brought tears to Nora's eyes when she first saw the elegant design. "It's too much," she protested, as the women of Wallace presented her with lengths of ivory silk and lace ordered specially from boys. "Nonsense," declared Mrs. Peterson firmly. "Every bride deserves beauty on her wedding day, especially one who has endured as much as you have, my dear." Throughout the winter, there was no sign of Thomas Blackwell, though Ben maintained vigilant precautions regarding Nora's safety. As February approached, bringing with it the final dissolution of her marriage to Thomas, Nora found herself holding her breath, waiting for some last-minute intervention or threat. But February came and went without incident. Judge Harding returned to Wallace specifically to finalize the divorce, signing the papers with a flourish and presenting them to Nora with a warm smile. "You are legally Nora Wilson now," he informed her, "free to determine your own future without constraint." That evening, Ben presented her with a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "I've been carrying this since Christmas," he admitted as he slipped it onto her finger, "waiting for the day when I could give it to you without any shadows between us." The first weeks of March brought an unexpected thaw, as if nature itself approved of their upcoming union. Snow melted from the lower slopes, and the first brave crocuses appeared near the church steps, harbingers of spring and new beginnings. The Friday before the wedding, Nora worked her final day at the Mercantile before a 2-week absence that Mr. Miller had insisted upon as a wedding gift. "You'll be back soon enough," he assured her as she organized the ledgers for her temporary replacement. "Though I expect married life with our deputy might occasionally distract you from columns of figures." Nora blushed at his teasing, though she couldn't deny the anticipation that had been building within her as the wedding approached. Ben had purchased a small house on Oak Street, not far from the center of town, but with enough land for a garden and perhaps, someday, room for children to play. The thought of becoming Ben's wife in every sense still brought moments of anxiety. Memories of Thomas's brutality in the marital bed were not easily banished, but Ben's patient understanding and unwavering respect had gradually replaced fear with hope. He had promised they would move at her pace, and Nora trusted him completely. As she left the Mercantile that afternoon, Nora's heart felt lighter than it had in years. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Ben Garrett, surrounded by friends who had become family in this mountain town that had offered her sanctuary when she needed it most. The evening brought a knock at her cottage door, Margaret, and several other women arriving to whisk her away for a modest celebration of her last night as a single woman. They gathered in Margaret's parlor for cake, gifts, and gentle advice about married life that ranged from practical household tips to more intimate suggestions that made Nora blush furiously. "Ben's a good man," Margaret assured her as the evening drew to a close. "He'll treat you like the treasure you are." "I know," Nora replied simply. "That's why I love him." Morning dawned clear and surprisingly warm for early March. Nora woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the distant sound of church bells calling Wallace to Saturday prayers. Today, those same bells would ring for her wedding. Margaret arrived early, bringing breakfast and practical assistance for the day ahead. As Nora bathed and washed her hair, her future sister-in-law laid out the wedding dress and accessories on the bed with reverent care. "It's perfect," Nora breathed when she finally stood before the mirror in the completed ensemble. The ivory silk gown was elegantly simple, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs and a modestly sweeping train. Margaret had arranged Nora's chestnut hair in a crown of loose curls, intertwined with small white flowers from the hothouse at the Hollowell estate outside town. "You're beautiful," Margaret declared, misty-eyed as she adjusted the short veil. "Ben won't know what hit him." A knock at the door heralded the arrival of Sally, resplendent in her role as flower girl, and Mr. Miller, who had asked for the honor of giving Nora away in her father's absence. "My goodness," the older man exclaimed when he saw her, his voice gruff with emotion. "You're a vision, Mrs. Wilson." The small procession made its way from the cottage to the Jenkins home, where guests were already gathering in the large parlor that had been transformed for the occasion. Flowers adorned every surface, their fragrance mingling with the scent of beeswax candles despite the daylight hour. Through the front windows, Nora caught a glimpse of Ben standing near the improvised altar, tall and handsome in a new black suit, his normally unruly hair tamed for the occasion. Marshall Porter stood beside him as best man, looking nearly as nervous as the groom himself. As the small string ensemble began to play, Nora took a deep breath, her hand resting on Mr. Miller's arm. This was the moment she had both dreamed of and feared might never come, the beginning of a life built on love and respect rather than control and fear. "Ready, my dear?" Mr. Miller asked softly. "More than ready," Nora replied with absolute certainty. The parlor doors opened, and Nora began her walk toward the future. Ben turned to watch her approach, and the naked adoration in his expression made her heart soar. This was right. This was meant to be. Pastor Mitchell welcomed the gathering and spoke briefly about the sanctity of marriage, words that might once have rung hollow to Nora, but now held new meaning as she stood beside the man who had shown her what true partnership could be. "Benjamin and Nora have chosen to speak their own vows," the pastor announced, stepping back to give them this moment. Ben took both her hands in his eyes never leaving hers as he spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "Nora Wilson, from the first moment I saw you, I recognized something in you that called to my soul a courage that persisted despite pain, a dignity that hardship couldn't diminish. You came to Wallace seeking safety, but you brought with you a light that has brightened all our lives, especially mine." His voice deepened with emotion as he continued. "I promise to honor your strength even as I offer my protection, to respect your independence even as I stand by your side, to cherish your spirit even as I hold your heart. I will be your partner, your advocate, and your safe harbor for all the days we are granted together." Tears blurred Nora's vision as she began her own vows, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "Ben Garrett, you found me when I was broken and showed me that I could be whole again. You offered protection without demanding submission, strength without requiring weakness in return. You taught me that love isn't a cage but a garden where both can flourish side by side." She squeezed his hands, drawing courage from his unwavering gaze. "I promise to trust the goodness in you even when fear whispers otherwise, to share my thoughts and dreams without reservation, to build with you a life of honesty, respect, and joy. I will be your partner, your confidante, and your true companion for all our days together." They exchanged rings, Ben's a simple gold band that matched her engagement ring, his own a slightly wider version that gleamed new and bright as Nora slipped it onto his finger. "By the authority vested in me," Pastor Mitchell proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Ben kissed her with tender reverence before their friends and neighbors, Nora felt the last shadows of her past recede, replaced by the bright promise of a future built on love freely given and received. The celebration that followed was everything a small-town wedding should be: abundant food prepared by many hands, music that set feet tapping, toasts that brought both laughter and tears, and the warm embrace of community surrounding the newly married couple. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Ben drew Nora aside for a moment of quiet amidst the festivities. "Are you happy, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked, the new name making both of them smile. "Completely," Nora assured him, leaning into the circle of his arm. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Ben replied, dropping a kiss on her temple. "Though I'll be happier still when we can slip away to our home." The house on Oak Street awaited them, prepared over the past weeks with furniture both purchased and gifted, linens hemmed by Margaret, and curtains sewn by Nora herself. It represented everything they would build together, a sanctuary of their own making, filled with love rather than fear. As twilight descended over Wallace, the newlyweds bid farewell to their guests amid good-natured teasing and heartfelt well-wishes. Ben helped Nora into the buggy he had decorated with ribbons and early spring flowers, and they set off through streets lined with townspeople offering final congratulations. "Welcome home, Mrs. Garrett," Ben said softly as they reached the neat white house with its welcoming porch. Lifting her into his arms, he carried her across the threshold with exaggerated care, setting her gently on her feet in the parlor where a fire had been laid ready in the hearth. "It's perfect," Nora breathed, taking in the cozy space with its comfortable furnishings, and the touches that already made it theirs. Ben's books alongside hers on the shelves, a quilt made by his mother draped over the sofa, the silver-framed photograph of her father given a place of honor on the mantel. Later, as they prepared for their first night as husband and wife, Nora felt a moment of trepidation, a shadow of old fears rising unbidden. Ben, ever perceptive, noticed her hesitation as she emerged from the dressing room in her new nightgown. "We have all the time in the world," he assured her, crossing to where she stood and taking her hands in his. "Nothing happens tonight or any night that you don't want, Nora. I meant what I said in my vows." The tenderness in his expression banished her anxiety. This was Ben, her protector, her champion, now her husband. With him, there would be only respect and care, never demands or cruelty. "I want to be your wife in every way," she told him honestly. "I just needed to hear your voice to remind myself that this is real, that you're real." "I'm real," Ben confirmed, bringing her hand to his chest so she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "And I love you more than words can express." Their first joining as husband and wife was gentle, unhurried, filled with whispered words of devotion and tender discoveries. Ben's patience and Nora's growing trust combined to create something beautiful, where once there had been only pain and fear. Afterward, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Nora rested her head on Ben's chest, listening to the strong, steady rhythm that had become the music of her life. "I never thought I could be this happy," she confessed softly. "After Thomas, I believed that part of me was broken forever." Ben's arms tightened around her. "Nothing about you is broken, Nora. You're the strongest person I've ever known." She pressed a kiss to his skin, marveling at the rightness of being here with him. "Because you helped me remember my own strength when I'd forgotten it existed." "No," Ben disagreed gently. "The strength was always yours. I just stood beside you while you reclaimed it." Spring blossomed fully in the weeks that followed, bringing new growth to the mountains and new joy to the house on Oak Street. Nora returned to her position at the mercantile, though now working only 3 days a week as she established their household and created a home that reflected their shared vision. Ben continued his duties as deputy, though Marshal Porter had begun speaking of retirement, suggesting that Ben might soon step into the role of town marshal. The mine dispute had been permanently resolved through a combination of fair-minded negotiation, and the mine owners' realization that local workers were ultimately more reliable than imported labor. Life developed a rhythm of contentment: mornings sharing coffee on their porch before work, evenings reading aloud to each other before the fire, Sundays at church followed by dinner with friends or family. They planted a garden together, discussed plans for eventually expanding their small house, and began to speak cautiously of children who might someday fill the extra bedrooms. In June, as Wallace prepared for its annual Independence Day celebration, a letter arrived at the marshal's office bearing a St. Louis postmark. Ben brought it home that evening, his expression serious as he handed it to Nora. "It's addressed to me officially," he explained as she examined the envelope with trepidation. "But it concerns you." Together they sat on the porch swing, the warm summer evening fragrant with Nora's roses, as Ben opened the letter and began to read aloud. "Deputy Garrett, I write to inform you that Thomas Blackwell passed away on June 12th following complications from pneumonia. As his attorney, I am obligated to notify his former wife, Mrs. Nora Wilson, now Mrs. Garrett as I understand, of certain provisions in his will." Nora gasped softly, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her at the news of Thomas's death. Ben squeezed her hand before continuing. "Mr. Blackwell directed that the sum of $5,000 be paid to Mrs. Garrett as, in his words, compensation for distress caused during our marriage. This amount has been deposited in her name at the First Bank of St. Louis and can be transferred to a bank of her choosing upon receipt of proper documentation." The letter concluded with legal formalities and the attorney's signature, followed by a personal note. "Mrs. Garrett, while professional ethics prevent me from commenting directly on my client's actions, please know that many in St. Louis were more aware of your situation than you might have realized. May you find peace in your new life." Silence fell between them as Ben folded the letter, giving Nora time to process its implications. "He's gone," she finally whispered, her voice catching. "Really gone?" "Yes," Ben confirmed, watching her closely. "How do you feel about that?" Nora considered the question honestly. "Relieved," she admitted. "And sad in a way I can't quite explain. Not for Thomas himself, but for the waste of it all, the man he could have been if cruelty hadn't consumed him." "That compassion is part of what makes you extraordinary," Ben said softly. "Most would feel only satisfaction at such news." "And the money?" Nora asked, still struggling to comprehend that final gesture from a man who had caused her so much pain. "What do you think it means?" Ben considered before answering. Perhaps, in the end, facing his own mortality, Thomas found a moment of conscience. Or perhaps it was simply his final attempt to control your narrative to position himself as ultimately generous despite everything. "We don't need his money," Nora said firmly. "Our life is full and good without it." "True," Ben agreed. "But we could use it for something meaningful, something that transforms his attempt at controlling your story into a force for good." A thoughtful expression crossed Nora's face. "Like what?" "Whatever you wish," Ben replied. "It's your decision entirely." In the days that followed, as news of Thomas's death and unexpected bequest circulated through Wallace, Nora contemplated what to do with the money that represented both her pain and her final liberation from her past. The answer came unexpectedly during a conversation with Sally Jenkins, who was lamenting that Wallace had no proper library for children who loved reading as she did. "We just have the little shelf at school," the girl complained as she helped Nora weed the garden. "And those books are so old and boring." That evening, Nora shared her idea with Ben as they sat on their porch watching fireflies rise from the summer grass. "What if we used Thomas's money to establish a proper library for Wallace?" she suggested. "A place of knowledge and imagination and possibility, everything he tried to limit in my life." Ben's smile was answer enough. "I think that would be perfect," he said, drawing her close against his side. "A legacy of light instead of darkness." By the following spring, the Wallace Public Library opened its doors in a small but well-designed building near the school. Nora served as its first librarian, working 3 days a week to establish collections and programs while maintaining her position at the Mercantile the other 2 days. The library quickly became a center of community life, hosting reading groups for children, literacy classes for minors wishing to improve their education, and providing resources for the growing town's businesses and families. And if visitors wondered about the silver plaque near the entrance that reads simply, "Founded in memory of James Wilson, who taught his daughter to love books and freedom in equal measure," only Nora, Ben, and a few close friends understood its full significance. The years passed with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Ben was appointed town marshal when Porter retired, bringing his thoughtful approach to justice and community safety to the growing settlement. Wallace prospered as the mines continued to produce, and the railroad finally reached the town, connecting it more firmly to the wider world. In the autumn of 1877, Nora gave birth to their first child, a son they named James Benjamin Garrett, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Elizabeth Margaret Garrett, who from her earliest days showed the same quiet strength that had seen her mother through her darkest times. The house on Oak Street expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Ben adding rooms with his own hands, assisted by friends from throughout Wallace. The garden flourished under Nora's care, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for their souls. Through all the ordinary joys and challenges of marriage and parenthood, Ben and Nora remained each other's steadfast partners, honoring the vows they had made with a depth of understanding that could only come from having glimpsed the alternative. On their 10th anniversary, as they walked along the ridge above town where Ben had proposed, Nora paused to look down at Wallace spread below them, the neat streets, the church spire, the library with its distinctive blue door, and the home they had created together. "What are you thinking?" Ben asked, his arm around her waist, his face lined now with a decade of laughter and responsibility, but still handsome in the afternoon light. "I'm thinking about that day I stepped off the stage," Nora replied, leaning into his embrace. How terrified I was, how certain that I would never feel safe again. Ben's arms tightened around her. And now, Nora turned to face him, reaching up to touch the face that had become as familiar and necessary to her as her own heartbeat. Now I know that safety isn't about locks and walls, or even about the absence of threats. It's about having the courage to build a life on your own terms, surrounded by people who recognize your worth. You taught me that, Ben said softly. Your courage taught me what real strength looks like. And you showed me what real love feels like, Nora replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed their journey from strangers to soulmates. As they walked hand in hand down the trail toward home, where their children waited with Margaret and Jim for the anniversary celebration, Nora reflected that the painful path that had brought her to Wallace had led, ultimately, to a joy deeper and more enduring than she could ever have imagined. Thomas's shadow had long since faded, replaced by the bright reality of a life built on love, respect, and the unshakable foundation of being truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. She was Nora Garrett, now wife, mother, librarian, friend. And in Ben's eyes, in their children's laughter, in the community that had embraced her, she had found not just protection but belonging, the true meaning of home.